I'm Zach Cote of Thinking Nation, and in this video we're going to explore the thinking skill of quantitative analysis. Now, before anyone gets upset and says math doesn't belong in history class, I want us to acknowledge just how crucial quantitative analysis is to doing good historical research. When I was a senior in college, we were given an assignment for this class on the American Revolution. And our professor shared with us an Excel file that had a couple thousand names of soldiers and various descriptions of the soldiers that could be tracked down. It could be their age, it could be their rank, it could be their city of birth, it could be their city of enlistment. Some of the columns were very full on the table, and some of the columns were not. And the professor simply said, this needs to be your focus source for your research paper for this class. And so in that moment, this classroom full of history students had to engage in the skill of quantitative analysis before we could actually engage in historical thinking. Or along the way of engaging in quantitative analysis, we were incorporating our skills of historical thinking. So as we dive into the skill, let's start with the definition. What is quantitative analysis? Quantitative analysis involves the process of evaluating data that is shown visually through tables, charts, graphs, maps, and infographics. By analyzing patterns, conclusions can be drawn about behaviors, institutions, processes, and policies. Critical investigations also yield possible limitations for the data presented. So there's a lot here in quantitative analysis. We have to sort the data, make meaning of the data, analyze patterns of the data, and then draw conclusions from the data. Of course, when we're engaging in quantitative analysis, it's really important to establish parameters. What does this look like? There's 4 questions that we can ask when establishing parameters. What information is the data addressing? How is the data being presented? What variables can be identified? Are there limitations in the data? So if we go back to that table from the American Revolution, these were all soldiers. And so I know that it was a list of soldiers from the American Revolution. It was presented as a table with columns for different characteristics of those soldiers. And then those columns represented the variables. But there were a lot of limitations. Some soldiers, we knew nothing but their name. Other soldiers, we may have known their rank, that they were in the Navy, and their birthday. And other soldiers, we may have not known their birthday, but we did know the day of their death. And so this presented certain limitations and challenged the way that we looked at the data and made meaning of the data. And once the terms are defined, once we go through those parameters, that's what we get to do. We get to make meaning of the data. And that allows us to make inferences and draw conclusions from those inferences, and then assess the reliability of those conclusions. If we get down to the end of it and we feel like we have a strong claim using the data, but we realize that the limitations were so great and the data was so scarce, we then have to think through are these conclusions reliable? And this is a really slow and methodical process, but it's in those seemingly mundane tasks of sifting through the data that we begin to draw those inferences or, establish those conclusions about the data, and that's when history really gets exciting and comes to life. When we practice quantitative analysis as historians, we make meaning of that data, which then allows us to tell a more complete and accurate story of the people, the places, and the events that we study in the past.